Michael's life had become a pattern of sameness. He woke at 6, drove through traffic, worked long hours at an office in downtown Seattle, and returned to his small apartment where silence always greeted him first. His fridge was half empty. His couch held the impression of his body from too many evenings spent watching shows he barely paid attention to. At 36, he had everything people told him he should want: a stable job, financial security, a quiet home. But every night, when he sat alone at the edge of his bed, he felt the hollowness growing deeper. One evening, his best friend Daniel called and insisted he come to a small gathering. Michael almost refused. Social events had become exhausting. He preferred his predictable solitude. But Daniel was persistent, reminding him how long it had been since they'd spent time together. Reluctantly, Michael agreed, telling himself it was just one night out. Nothing more. The gathering was at Daniel's house. Warm with the sound of laughter, the smell of food, and the casual comfort of old friends, Michael entered quietly, nodded to familiar faces, and poured himself a drink. He expected the evening to pass as it always did: small talk, polite smiles, and a quick exit. But then she appeared, Claire. Michael froze for a second when she walked into the room. He knew her, of course he did. She was Daniel's younger sister, the girl who used to tag along years ago when they were in college. Back then, she was just the kid sister who hovered around the edges, eager to join conversations but always brushed aside. That was years ago. What stood before him now was no kid. Claire had changed. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived, failed, learned, and grown. Her hair framed her face softly. Her smile was both familiar and entirely new. In her eyes, those eyes held a spark he couldn't look away from. She had just moved back from New York after years of chasing a career in design. Daniel had mentioned it once in passing, but Michael hadn't thought much of it. Seeing her now, he realized how much time had truly passed. She noticed him almost instantly. Her face lit up. She crossed the room with a smile that made something inside him shift. "Michael," she said warmly, so she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I can't believe it's you. It's been forever." He managed to smile, trying to steady himself. "Claire, wow, you look different. Grown up, I mean." Her laugh was soft, playful, and it disarmed him completely. "Well, it has been almost 10 years. I hope I've changed a little." They began to talk. At first about the simple things: her years in New York, his steady job, the familiar rhythms of Seattle life. But soon, the conversation took on a rhythm of its own. They shared stories, traded jokes, and laughed in a way that made time feel like it was slipping through their fingers. Around them, the party moved on, but for Michael, it was as though the noise faded into the background. At one point, they both reached for the same glass of wine on the counter. Their hands brushed, light as air, but the contact sent a quiet jolt through him. He pulled back quickly, but not before catching the way she looked at him. It wasn't casual. It wasn't just a friendly glance. Her eyes lingered, searching his face as though asking a question she didn't dare speak aloud. Michael's chest tightened. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the moment. But when she leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice, he knew it wasn't his imagination. "It feels like I've been waiting to see you again," she whispered. Her words delicate, almost uncertain, but powerful enough to echo inside him long after she spoke them. He swallowed, trying to find an answer. Every part of him knew there were lines that should never be crossed. She was Daniel's sister. She was younger. She was someone tied to his past, a part of a family that trusted him. Yet standing there, hearing her say those words, he couldn't ignore the truth forming in the pit of his stomach. For the rest of the night, found himself drawn to her without meaning to. She stayed close, her laughter breaking through his guarded silence, her stories filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Every time he looked away, he caught her watching him. Every time she spoke, he leaned in without thinking. When the evening ended, Michael left before anyone else. He needed air, needed distance, needed to silence the storm brewing in his mind. Driving home through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting on wet pavement, He tried to convince himself it was nothing more than nostalgia. She was just an old friend, someone from his past who had grown into her own life. That's all it was. But her voice lingered. "It feels like I've been waiting to see you again." The words replayed in his head as he parked his car, as he walked into his apartment, as he sat down in the stillness of his living room. He ran his hand across his face, leaned back, and exhaled. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. But the truth was undeniable. For the first time in years, something inside him had woken up. Something he thought was gone. And it terrified him as he switched off the lights and tried to sleep. Michael realized his life was no longer the same quiet, predictable pattern it had been just hours earlier. One evening had changed everything, and though he didn't want to admit it, part of him wanted to see her again. The morning after the gathering, Michael tried to bury himself in routine. He brewed his coffee, scanned through emails, and forced his mind onto work. Yet no matter how many spreadsheets or meetings filled his day, Claire's voice kept slipping through. He remembered the curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes, and most of all, the whisper that refused to fade. That evening, as he sat on his couch scrolling aimlessly through his phone, a message appeared. His chest tightened the moment he saw her name. "Coffee tomorrow?" "Just us." Michael stared at the words. It was simple, casual, innocent on the surface. But he knew better. He knew there was something unspoken behind those 3 short words. For a long moment he hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen, torn between reason and longing. Then, before he could stop himself, he typed back, "Sure, tell me where." The next day, they arrived at a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the city. Rain had just passed, leaving the streets glistening under the soft gray light. Michael pushed open the glass door, the scent of roasted beans wrapping around him, and scanned the room. Claire was already there, sitting near the window. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair tied loosely as if she hadn't tried too hard. Yet she looked effortlessly graceful. She saw him and smiled, a smile that reached her eyes and sent a rush of warmth through him. "Michael," she said, rising slightly before sitting back down. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," he admitted honestly, sliding into the seat across from her. "Why?" she asked, tilting her head. He hesitated, then gave a faint smile. "Because I wasn't sure if it was a good idea." Her eyes softened, as though she understood without needing explanation. "And yet you're here." Their conversation began with safe topics, her time in New York, the challenges of starting over, his work, and the long hours that kept him tied to a desk. They laughed about old memories from Daniel's college days, moments they had both witnessed from different angles. Slowly, the walls between them lowered. Claire had a way of speaking that drew him in, not just with her words, but with the sincerity behind them. She didn't shy away from admitting her struggles, her loneliness, her search for belonging after years away. Michael found himself opening up too, sharing thoughts he rarely voiced. Confessions about how routine had dulled his life, and how often he wondered if he had missed something essential along the way. Minutes turned into hours. The world outside blurred, the chatter of the cafe faded. All that seemed to exist was the table between them and the invisible thread pulling them closer. At one point, Claire reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. Michael froze. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but her eyes told him it wasn't by chance. He should have pulled away, created distance, but instead, his hand lingered just long enough to acknowledge her touch. Her voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for him. "I know we shouldn't, but I'm enjoying this." The words struck him like a storm. They were gentle, yet dangerous, innocent yet loaded. Michael's pulse quickened, his thoughts tangled between what was right and what was undeniable. He wanted to remind her of the line between them, Daniel, family, consequences. But when he looked at her, all he saw was honesty. She wasn't playing a game. She was simply telling the truth. Michael drew in a breath, searching for steady ground. "Claire, this. It's complicated, I know," she said softly, "but it feels real." Silence hung between them, heavy yet tender. Neither moved, neither spoke for a long moment. Outside, people passed by, umbrellas in hand, living their ordinary lives. Inside, Michael felt anything but ordinary. When the waitress came by to refill their cups, the spell broke for a moment. They pulled their hands back, smiled politely, and acted as though nothing unusual had happened. But when the waitress walked away, their eyes met again. The silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could, as the afternoon stretched on. Finally stood to leave. The sky had cleared, the sun breaking through the gray. They walked side by side, their shoulders almost touching, both careful not to say what lingered in their hearts. At the corner, where their paths would split, Claire paused. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "Micah." The weeks that followed became a blur of secret moments. It started with small things and exchange of messages late at night. Short calls when they couldn't sleep. A walk by the waterfront when no one else was around. Every time Michael told himself it would be the last, something pulled him back. Claire had become a part of his days. Slipping into his life so naturally, it was as if she had always been there. But with every laugh they shared, and every look that lingered too long, the weight of silence grew heavier. Michael carried it with him at work, in conversations with Daniel, even in the quiet of his apartment. It was more than the fear of being discovered. It was the knowledge that what they had wasn't supposed to exist. One Friday evening, Michael met Daniel for dinner. They sat in their usual booth at a small bar, ordering burgers and beer like old times. Daniel talked about work, about the stress of managing deadlines, about the Seahawks' latest game. Michael nodded and laughed in the right places, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time Daniel mentioned his family, Michael felt a twist in his stomach. If Daniel knew about the late-night calls, the walks by the lake, the stolen moments, what would he think? What would it do to their friendship? Michael excused himself early, claiming exhaustion. But instead of driving home, he found himself parked outside Claire's apartment. He hadn't planned it, hadn't even texted her, but his car stopped there as if it had a will of its own. He sat in the driver's seat, debating with himself, torn between leaving and knocking on her door. Before he could decide, the door opened, and Claire stepped out, her eyes widening in surprise. "Michael?" she asked softly, clutching her sweater around her shoulders. He got out of the car, feeling both foolish and relieved. "I was just driving by," he lied, though they both knew the truth. She studied him for a moment, then gestured for him to come inside. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with books, sketches, and the faint scent of lavender. She handed him a mug of tea without asking what he wanted, as though she already knew. For a while they sat in silence. Rain tapped gently against the window, filling the quiet spaces between them. Finally, Claire spoke. "Do you ever feel like we're standing on the edge of something, afraid to move forward but unable to step back?" Michael looked at her, the question sinking deep. "Every day," he admitted. Her eyes softened. "It scares me. But at the same time, it feels right." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just us. There's Daniel. There's everyone else." "If they found out I know," she interrupted. "I've thought about it too. The judgment, the disappointment. But Michael, when I'm with you, none of that feels bigger than this." She pressed her hand against her chest, as though trying to calm her own heartbeat. He wanted to argue, to remind her of the risks, but her words struck a truth he couldn't deny. She filled the empty spaces in his life. She made him laugh when he thought he'd forgotten how. She made him feel alive again, and he was terrified of losing that. That night, he didn't stay long. They talked, they laughed, they sat close enough to feel each other's presence, but when it grew late, he stood to leave. Claire walked him to the door, her expression caught between hope and hesitation. "Michael," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what it would be like if we didn't have to hide?" The question froze him in place. He did wonder. Every day, he imagined what it would be like to sit across from her at family dinners without guilt, to hold her hand in public, to live without the shadow of secrecy. But he also imagined Daniel's face if he ever discovered the truth. "I wonder," Michael whispered, meeting her gaze. "More than I should." Claire gave a faint smile, though her eyes glistened. "That's enough for now." When he drove home, the streets blurred around him. He couldn't shake her voice. her question. It echoed louder than any warning he gave himself. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. They walked in quiet neighborhoods, shared dinners and out-of-the-way cafes, spoke on the phone until one of them drifted to sleep. Each moment carried the thrill of being discovered and the sweetness of connection. But beneath it all was the weight. Michael carried it like a stone in his chest. He thought about Daniel, often his loyalty, his trust, his laughter through the years. And he thought about the betrayal that would cut through all of it if this secret ever came to light. One evening, while walking by the lake with Claire, he tried to voice the conflict inside him. "This can't go on forever," he said, staring at the rippling water. Claire looked at him, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "I know, but what choice do we have? Pretend we don't feel this? Walk away as if none of it mattered?" "It would be easier," Michael muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Would it?" she asked gently. "Or would it just hurt differently?" Her question left him silent. She was right. Walking away wouldn't erase what had begun between them. It would only replace longing with regret. Regret was heavier to carry than any secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Claire slipped her hand into his. For a moment, Michael hesitated, then tightened his grip. The world around them continued, children laughing in the distance. Joggers passing by, but in that instant, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. He knew it couldn't last. He knew secrets had a way of breaking free, of tearing apart everything they touched. But with her hand in his, he couldn't imagine letting go. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, Michael realized he was already too far in. The silence, the fear, the danger, none of it mattered enough to stop him. Claire wasn't just someone from his past anymore. She had become his present, and whether it ended in heartbreak or something neither of them could predict. Michael knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to give her up. The storm rolled into Seattle on a Sunday afternoon, dark clouds swallowing the light. Michael sat in his car outside Claire's apartment, the windshield streaked with heavy rain. He hadn't planned on coming. He had spent the morning pacing his apartment, trying to convince himself to cut things off, to finally do the right thing. But instead of finding answers, he found himself here again. Heart pounding as the storm raged around him, Claire slid into the passenger seat without a word. She looked tired, her hair damped from the rain, her eyes shadowed with something heavy. For a long while they sat in silence. The only sound, the steady rhythm of rain against the roof. Neither of them knew how to begin, but both knew this was the moment they couldn't avoid any longer. Michael gripped the steering wheel, staring at the blurred glow of streetlights through the fogged glass. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "We can't keep doing this, Claire. It's not fair to you, to me, to anyone." Her hands trembled in her lap, but her voice was steady. "I know, I've told myself the same thing every day. But when I try to stay away, I feel like I'm losing a part of myself." He turned toward her, his chest tightening at the sight of tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't understand how dangerous this is. Daniel, he trusts me. If he finds out, it could destroy everything." "I do understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But Michael, what am I supposed to do? Pretend I don't feel what I feel? Pretend that these moments don't mean anything?" The storm outside grew louder, thunder rumbling in the distance. Michael leaned back, pressing a hand against his forehead. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore." Claire reached for him then, her hand sliding over his. Her touch was warm despite the cold air, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers. "Listen to me," she said softly, her eyes searching his. "I can't pretend anymore. I know it's complicated. I know it's forbidden. But my heart doesn't listen to rules. When I'm with you, I feel like I'm finally where I belong." Michael's breath caught. He had tried for weeks to silence the truth, to push it away, but her words shattered every barrier he had built. He wanted to speak, to tell her how much she meant to him, how she had brought life back into his gray, lonely days. But fear held him still, the fear of what they could lose, of what lay ahead if they admitted what they both knew. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "Claire, this isn't easy. Loving you means risking everything." She leaned closer, her voice a whisper against the storm. Maybe the hardest choices are the ones that matter most. Her words sank into him, heavy and undeniable. He looked at her, really looked at her, the hope in her eyes, the courage it took to speak so openly, and in that moment, he knew the truth he had been running from. He couldn't let her go. Their hands intertwined, fingers lacing together as though they had been meant to fit all along. The world outside blurred, the storm muffling everything beyond the car. It was just them, suspended in a fragile bubble of honesty. Claire's lips trembled as she whispered the words he would never forget. "I'm enjoying this, Michael. Every stolen moment, every laugh, every secret. Even if the world doesn't understand, I don't regret it." Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her forever, but forever felt too heavy, too uncertain. Instead, he gave her the truth he could manage. "I don't regret it either." For a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands joined, their breaths unsteady. The storm raged on, but inside the car, time felt suspended. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close, something raw and real. Finally, Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closey.